Hi, this is Maria Walsh and welcome to the Parachute Candidate podcast. Joining me for today's conversation is Dr. Gladys Ganiel, Professor of Sociology at Queen's University. Dr. Ganiel focuses her work on the role of religion in conflict in both Northern Ireland and Zimbabwe, as well as Catholicism in Ireland, evangelicalism, and the emerging church. And most recently, her work has focused on religion in societies emerging from COVID-19. She has written several books and has lived on the island of Ireland since 1999 and in Belfast, Northern Ireland since 2006. This is an important conversation because religion is difficult to discuss, but to me, an important area to lean into and learn from. Like many growing up in Ireland or to Irish parents overseas, I was raised Catholic and was educated in Catholic schools. My faith and finding God in my daily work has remained steadfast, which often surprises some folks when they learn I'm a member of the LGBTI+ community and I'm pro-choice. But this is why I really believe this conversation is imperative. I don't always understand the vast complexities of faith and religions, and I can't rhyme off verses of the Bible, and I absolutely do not always follow the sermon at Mass. But that doesn't mean I'm not religious, does it? Why does our world feel so uncomfortable right now? And we are witnessing, both online and offline, a polarising world with religion being used as one of the categories used to divide us. My conversation with Dr. Gladys Ganiel today is significant. Gladys is American-born, and as mentioned, she has lived on the island of Ireland since 1999. We discuss her upbringing, her career to date, and the issues impacting religious orders. She weaves us through the history and the current state of play of religion on the island of Ireland. In recent Irish Times interview she shared, religious identification tells you something, but mass attendance and church attendance tells you more. Here's our conversation. But thank you very much, Gladys, for gifting time and being involved in the Parachute Candidate, which is the podcast about bringing more conversation, ideas, challenging the bias and stereotypes that we have to certain issues. And religion is one of those issues. For me here in the European Parliament, it often gets used as left and right, conservative or free-spirited. This loose language about how it plays a role in politics, how it doesn't. And really, I grew up Roman Catholic, going into a church, or I attend Lochderg, which is in Ireland for anybody listening outside of Ireland. I like to go to these spaces to find time and root myself. I'm a big Camino walker too, so for me, all of those journeys make sense. But I have been challenged myself in terms of historically where the church has been, in terms of Roman Catholic, where it is now, and as someone who's LGBTQI, I often get challenged. Like, how can you sit somewhere and hear a preach that's not inclusive of you? But I jokingly always say, we always have issues with middle management, and when I get to the pearly gates, what I've done on the world is what will ultimately determine what comes next or not next. But for you, Gladys, I'd love to hear your story, how faith is so important to you, what that means to you, and ultimately, just hear from you.
I'll start at the beginning in a way. I grew up in rural Maine in the United States. So Maine is on the East Coast by Canada. And my parents took me to a small Baptist church. So quite evangelical, if we want to use that term, and conservative and so forth. At the same time, that faith was like a positive aspect of my life, I suppose. Talking about as a child or a teenager, you felt you experienced the presence of God and these sorts of things. So that was important to me. Jumping ahead quite rapidly, I still am a runner, and I got an athletic scholarship to go to Providence College. Now, some listeners may be aware that is a mecca for Irish runners. The coach there is Ray Tracy, brother of Olympic silver medalist John Tracy. So in Providence, I was surrounded by Irish people, really. And every once in a while, they would have conversations about Ireland and the Catholic Church, or Northern Ireland and the Troubles, and so forth. And this was in the late 90s. So I was in Providence. I graduated in 1999. So the year before I graduated, Good Friday Agreement was signed. And of course, George Mitchell is from Maine, my home state. So the mediator of the Good Friday Agreement was someone who had come and spoken at my high school, when I was in in high school and that. So I suppose that combination of experiences, religion being a positive thing in my life, or the experience of God being positive in my life, and then being in Providence, and the peace process kind of unfolding during that time, sparked my interest. And when I finished as an undergraduate there, I had a scholarship that allowed me to study anywhere in the world. So I went to UCD and did a master's in politics, and then stayed on there to do my PhD, where I looked at evangelicalism in Northern Ireland. And of course, myself, having been brought up in an evangelical tradition, I was fascinated by how that had played out in another part of the world. And Ian Paisley, I suppose the evangelicals who had started to critique Paisley and the way he had mixed religion and politics, and how they had then tried to, I suppose, reform their own faith tradition to try to be one that was, I suppose, more interested in peace building and reconciliation and so forth.
Can I ask, just for those listening who are hearing like evangelical, the different types of religions, because I gotta give it to you. There's times where I'm like, I don't understand the difference, and perhaps it's too simplistic to Gladys, where I walk into a space and I'm like, I either feel at home in it or I feel not, and that's ultimately where I decide to remain or go. But for you, what is the differences for those listening?
I suppose, I can give you an academic definition of evangelicalism. It probably won't surprise you that academics have argued about this for decades, right? But David Bevington, who's a historian, had this fourfold definition, and I think it is helpful as an orientation. So one of the aspects is that evangelicals believe you have to be converted, or maybe would use that language, be born again, have this experience where you, I suppose, consciously become a Christian. You can't kind of be born into it. You have to have that experience yourself. The Bible is very important. So some evangelicals would be literal interpreters of the Bible. Others, would say the Bible is inspired, but would, add that it doesn't have to be literal, as it were. So there's disagreement with evangelicalism itself. There's a strong emphasis on, that crucifixion and resurrection of Christ as a historical event. And then the fourth aspect is that evangelicalism would have a very activist component. So that might be in the form of trying to convert people. And in the North, there's still the street preachers who go out and so on and so forth. So that emphasis on conversion. But not all evangelicals would say that's the be all and end all. Others would see their faith acted out through, social justice, social action campaigns. So faith isn't something that's private. It's something that has to make a difference in the world. So those four broad areas would, I suppose, encapsulate evangelicalism. But within it, there's a huge diversity. Because as I said earlier, on the one hand, you had Ian Paisley. And then on the other hand, you had people who call themselves evangelicals, but literally saw it as part of their vocation or their mission from God to critique what Paisley was saying, and to say, that's not really being true to Christianity or being true to our tradition either. So it's a diverse movement. And I suppose often it gets caricatured as the right wing element as well, because that's what garners, I suppose, the most attention.
Because I sit in the European Parliament. I sit in the European People's Party, which, again, over the 2019 campaign, the only time sitting in an EPP group ever came up was around my sexuality, in terms of how can you sit with quite a Christian democratic group, and then issues with one or two other countries that weren't showing Christian democratic values, in terms of Hungary and Poland, particularly around LGBTQI rights or various other issues. But someone had told me, well, the EPP is a broad church. We are a broad church, and we have various different religious beliefs. And for me, that became super interesting, particularly when we hear debate and we're discussing certain things too within the group, and how much more it's becoming. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It's being weaponized, as is minority groups, and religion being that, well, I'm this and this is where I stand. And perhaps it's because of the bubble I'm in, right now. And I'm super conscious of even my language around religion because of the privilege I sit in the Parliament. But yet when I go to a church or a spiritual place, it's how you show up as a person versus the type of layers of life you're living, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose there's a difference between what you're talking about, the politicized and the weaponized religion, and then what people experience as believers or in their everyday religious lives. So within the field of the sociology of religion, which is where I do a lot of work, there's a whole kind of subfield of everyday religion. And it focuses just on the simple things people do every day to connect with God, to connect with others, to serve or whatever. And I'm not saying it's totally divorced from that politicized element, but if you only see that politicized element, it doesn't really capture what religion is all about for the vast majority of people. Back in the 1990s, now this has changed in the United States because things have gotten very polarized there, but back in the 1990s, Christian Smith, a sociologist of religion, did like a study of evangelicalism. And even at that time in the 90s, there was this idea that it was all right wing. But in his study, actually found when he talked to these people, it wasn't as stark as, people have been led to believe. Now that has changed somewhat because things have become more polarized and more politicized. But now what you get in the United States is people talking about white Christian nationalism. And so that's a new term that's come up in the last few years or whatever. And that probably more accurately than evangelicalism captures that politicized dynamic of it. So we have to, I think, make these distinctions when we're thinking about faith and so forth, because to only focus on the political doesn't really capture what it's all about for the vast majority of people who pray or turn up to a religious service or go on a pilgrimage or whatever it is they do.
Can I ask then, picking up from that, like, why is religion then so important to you now in 2023, and ultimately the importance of religion in the world? So like a twofold, and do you see them connected?
Yeah, well, I suppose from the point of view of, being an academic whose profession is to study religion, it better be important. But
it'd be hard to do every day. Interesting.
And Jared, I suppose I'll speak specifically first about the island of Ireland. So, everybody's aware that religion is declining. Less people are going to church. Its social and political influence is waning. Everybody's aware of those trends. At the same time, Ireland is still one of the most religious places in Europe, and particularly in Western Europe. So you've got that dynamic going on, which is interesting. So it's an interesting struggle, I suppose, between those who remain religious and those who don't. And of those who don't, those who have no ill will towards religious and those who are quite hostile to it, and perhaps due to their experiences. And then there's also in Ireland, there's the historical legacy of religion, which is really important. And this historical legacy, I would use this term haunting. It really haunts the whole island. And I think there's two main ways that the historical legacy of religion does this. This is through, and I'll call them sins, really, just to use the language, the sin of sectarianism and the sin of abuse. These are huge things that the churches as institutions and, individual Christians participated in creating sectarianism and creating these cultures of abuse. And then if they didn't directly create them, perpetuating them or turning a blind eye or whatever. Everybody to a certain extent was implicated in these two big sins. And the structures, not just the ideas, the bigoted ideas of sectarianism or the theologies of power that justified abuse, not just those ideas, but the structures that were created by religious institutions working in tandem, both north and south, with people in power in governments or whatever. Those structures remain, right? They remain in our schooling and they remain in our healthcare, particularly in the north. They remain in where people live, So that religion has shaped all that. And those two sins haven't really been dealt with by the churches. In recent years, there have been loads of apologies. So there have been apologies for abuse. So in the Republic of Ireland, the state has apologized for abuse. Various cardinals, archbishops, etc., have apologized. Pope Francis apologized. His apology when he made his visit here in the Phoenix Park, that was probably the best apology of them all. He seemed to have named the sins better than most of the other apologies. So there's been those apologies. And then even the church leaders have apologized for, I suppose, their role in sectarianism as well. So 2021, and the 4 church leaders and the president of the Irish Council of Churches had this statement where, they apologize for putting the idols of state and nation before, the Christian duty to love one another. Basically, that's not the exact words they use, but they did use that word idol, which was important. So we've had these apologies for these sins, I suppose, but at the same time, the structures remain. And because the church's influence has declined, not everybody noticed these apologies. Or if they didn't notice, like some of the ones, particularly some of the ones for abuse, weren't actually very good apologies either. The language was a bit, if we have caused any hurt, this sort of thing. So the apologies aren't adequate, yet the legacies of sectarianism and abuse haven't really been adequately addressed by the churches. And until that happens, those ghosts of religion past, if we want to use that term, are going to just haunt the island. And it really, can be a stumbling block to people who maybe are searching for as an experience of God or a spirituality as well.
I mean, that just as it gives me a segue into asking you about Northern Ireland and multiple countries that face, America too, that faced the impact of maybe two religions, particularly on the island of Ireland, and how that has dealt with. Now we know, which I'm really excited about or always proud about, our national, like my local national school in South Mayo, a small village called Shrew. When I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and moved to Ireland when I was 7 to the small community, classic national school. Across the road is the Catholic church, the football field, the post office is down the road, the sweet shop, all those great things that bring up that rural upbringing. And it was never a pick and mix, as in you went to that national school and then you went to the secondary school, because predominantly it was Catholic led. So Nan O'Neill inspired our national school. St. Joseph's National School is Nan O'Neill inspired my secondary school, and our primary school is called St. Joseph's, built on the Catholic teachings. Fast forward now to 2023, where we have multi-nationalities, multi-dominations, and that's really exciting. But ultimately then you're left with, on one level, this collective working together, and then on a very different level, historically, as you mentioned, in terms of polarizing of religions, particularly in Northern Ireland. Like, how do you explain that? Because I'm conscious, as we hear more and more about Northern Ireland, particularly around the Brexit negotiations, and then as we're building towards this narrative of an island, on whether it will combine and join or not. Religion is the beating heart of that, still quite energized and often really broken thought process, I think, where we absolutely can live in unison. We have been doing it. It just hasn't been done by all. Like, what's your thoughts on that? As I go around the house, Gladys, in terms of trying to explain it, I get so confused sometimes myself in when someone in Europe asks me, what's going on in Northern Ireland and why can't you all get together? It's not as simple as that.
Yeah. And I suppose the thing I always, when we get the new group of particularly master's students in, who are quite often international students, there's kind of two broad positions, simplistic positions. One is that religion is the cause of every bad problem, and the other is that religion doesn't matter at all. But the thing is that it meets somewhere in the middle in Northern Ireland, it's not, there's a religious difference. And in some ways that religious difference is, you could call it a marker. And it's a marker that marks out also differences in ethnicity and political allegiance and historically power as well. So, obviously, especially since the Good Friday Agreement, the balance of power between, nationalists, Catholics, and unionist Protestants has changed. That for half a century or more, Protestant unionists had, the most substantial power as well. So the trick, I suppose, is trying to understand where religion fit in all that, and historically what religion did was it provided some of the ideas that justified difference. And it also, particularly on the Protestant side, provided the ideas that justified, power, and some of the theologies and such that were, I suppose, used to justify settlement and colonization are similar to what the Calvinist settlers who went to the United States used. We are a chosen people coming to a promised land. This God has given us this land, and therefore it is rightfully ours in a sense. And that was the same sort of narrative you got from the Pilgrims in the United States. This idea in the States, it was called Manifest Destiny, or a City on a Hill, that justified the westward expansion across the United States. And there was a similar theology with Calvinist concepts of the chosen people and the elect, and the covenant with God for this land were used to justify conquest, really. So you had the theological justification for settlement, really. And then you had churches seeking out relationships with political power. Both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches did this on the island of Ireland. And that seeking of political power then made sure that the churches were embedded in the structures of society that then perpetuated the divisions and so forth. And I mean, in some ways, the historical relationship between the churches and political power in Ireland, it's not unusual. In the rest of Europe, they were state churches. This is what churches did everywhere in Europe. Sought political power and political influence. But in the last century or more, there's been a Christian theological critique of that. This was not what the church is called to do. The church isn't called to seek power. The church is called to serve and critique power. And if there's the temptation to become very close to political power, become close to the state, to try to, I suppose, get conformity and get people to come through the church doors or whatever. But the critique is that was A, wrong, and B, actually doesn't really work in terms of nourishing a population of people who then can have an authentic experience of God and an authentic spirituality as well. And I mean, in some ways, the churches have moved away from that seeking of power, whether it's down to a sincere, heartfelt critique that this is the right thing to do, or it's out of necessity because that power has been lost and it's not coming back. It's probably a combination, of both of those things. But in terms of, if the churches want to have some sort of societal role, it can't be one that I don't think it can be one that sort of seeks out power. It's one that has to have a distance from the state so that it can critique the abuse of power, wherever that may be.
Do you think they're moving towards that?
Well, some are, some are. But I suppose the flip side of that is, that move may be happening, but at the same time,
it's not being felt.
It's not being felt, and people aren't listening anymore. But actually, to be honest, in the North, it is a bit different. So the church leaders and coverage of religion in the media and so forth, I think, is a bit more now than it would be in the South, and you actually even got that a bit during the pandemic. And this is reflected in the way I think that the governments, North and South, interacted with the churches around lockdown restrictions and so forth. In the South, it seemed to me that, the government dictated and the churches basically did what, whereas in the North, there was more of a give and take relationship. And while ultimately the restrictions in the North were very similar to what was in the South, it was a more negotiated relationship. So the churches at one point voluntarily said, look, we'll close. You don't have to make us close, it said to the Northern Ireland government and so on and so forth. So there was a less maybe hostile, and hostile is maybe the wrong word, but a less dictatorial relationship with the government in the North and the churches during the pandemic than maybe you had in the South, kind of reflecting the greater still societal influence of the churches here in the North.
Can I ask, and I hope you just roll with me on this one, because this might need to be super cut. So throwing in some pop culture references here. I grew up in a household that one of my favorite programs was Seventh Heaven, because I was really inspired by the preaching and, using everyday examples. I understood them more. Like, I could see them, and they didn't seem so lofty or so foreign to me. And then you have things like, and actually there's a beautiful church in Rathmines that I used to go to in college, that their Sunday evening service used to be very similar. Like, you would see the priest come off the altar and it was about, here's the lessons from the gospel and this is what I suggest to go through for the week. And And I actually loved it because it was around every day showing up as a Christian, which is where I try and I try and go. People listen to probably be like, God, I didn't realize she's this religious, but it's more about everyday good practices and showing up as an authentic
Yeah.
person. So, and then you have the other flip of the coin, and not to only focus on the negative, but to try and get your understanding on this is then you have the likes of Spotlight movie, and you have Magdalene Laundries, and you have
Yes.
the wealth of church, and particularly in countries that I visited in Africa, where the wealth parameter is so different. Like, how do you say I'm a master's student coming in from overseas? Like, how do you teach about that? Like, how do you offer the balances between both there?
Well, I mean, I think power, I mentioned power a good few times today. Power is a good concept here when we're thinking about these things. And, churches are institutions, and institutions, any good sociologist will tell you, kind of are created, and then they kind of exist to perpetuate themselves. Do you know what I mean? And one way to perpetuate your institution is to seek and gain power and resources, and as much those resources and wealth as you can to
Explain it.
assure your continuance. Yeah. So in some ways, I mean, churches, like any institution, have done what institutions do. I mean, if you have an idealistic vision of it, that the church should be primarily of service to the poor, you could ask yourself, why has this critique not gotten through? And we've had these abuses of power, but I think power there is a key concept in helping people understand, and also understand, the temptation of power and what institutions need to do to try to step back from that and be self-critical and so forth, which is by no means an easy task. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's been written about the churches during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, so I suppose the clerics and the lay people who were, really prominent and enthusiastic Christian peace builders, were on the margins really of the institutional churches. John Brewer, who's a sociologist at Queen's as well, he called them mavericks, to indicate that they didn't quite fit in with their institutions that well. So while someone like Ken Newell, a Presbyterian minister, or Father Jerry Reynolds at Clonard Monastery, of course they're embedded within their church, but they're kind of mavericks on the margins because they were, to a certain extent, critiquing what the churches had done wrong, and then trying to live out an alternative picture of what the churches should be doing. They're critiquing that abuse of power, So what I would say to students, it's about a tradition being able to critique itself, critiquing how it has sought power when it probably shouldn't have, and also been able to critique the ideas or the theologies or the narratives that were used to justify that power, and then to use the resources from that tradition to come up with a new vision. And I mean, what an evangelical would do, right, is go back to the Bible and say, well, this is where you have interpreted that part of the Bible wrong, and this is what we think that we should be doing now. So you're using that emphasis on the Bible. There's an American theologian, Methodist, called Stanley Hauerwas, and there's this line he has that always has stuck with me. And it's about the churches in the West, right? Because the churches in the West have sought power, and took that power around the globe with colonialism and so on and so forth. And as the process of secularization accelerates, his line was that the churches of the West aren't dying, God is killing them, as kind of a consequence of that pursuit of power, and inappropriate pursuit of power. And then the task then of Christians here in the 21st century is to look at that and look at the broken pieces, I guess, and try to save what needs to be saved to build something, more appropriate, I suppose, that enables a Christianity that, that serves the poor, looks out for the marginalized, and is alert to the abuses of power. Because, I mean, we should never forget that Jesus lived in the Roman Empire, where there was a huge abuse of power, and that was his experience and the experience of his disciples. They lived in an oppressive empire, and the religion that they founded was a response to an oppressive empire.
So this is where my brain explodes, because then I have so many more questions, and we could be here for like 5 or 6 more hours. But when we look at everyday social issues, so I'm thinking the minority groups that are often on the attack, or being attacked is probably my better phrase. So LGBTI plus community, women's rights, and I don't mean around sexual reproductive rights or access to abortion services. I'm actually talking about the role of women and how over many years and for generations, the Catholic guilt often fell harder on the shoulders of women than they did on others. And, in that purity piece fell on women and not men. And the imbalance of that then to people of color, people who use addiction, be it alcohol or drugs, and may I also include food in that, because I think that is a very serious source of addiction too. Like, wrap that up into religion now. Like, how do you explain that then to? I'm going to keep with the student because I am your student today. But how do you wrap that up to a student? Because I hear quotes quite often, unfortunately. On one hand, it's like homosexuality wasn't even in the Bible, in from one person. The other is, well, actually is in the Bible and it's in it a lot and it's a sin. Mary Magdalene, in one sense, was a witness to Jesus Christ and was one of his lay people. On the other hand, she shifted to be a prostitute and a very dirty person from another narrative I heard. Now, with this sense, may I also put my hands up and say I did not go actively researching different things in that, because I didn't, and call that lazy guide to spirituality, which is wrong, and hence the reason why this is such an interesting conversation to me. But how do you encompass that, or how do you teach that with the lens of religion?
I mean, I suppose what I tried to say is that sometimes you get this view that religion is this thing and it's all worked out. So there's doctrines and there's beliefs, and this is what the church believes, and this is what the church believes, and Catholic Church believes this, the Presbyterians believe this, Church of God believe this. But that's not really true to a certain extent. There may be things written in the Westminster Confession of Faith or in canon law or whatever, and those may be official documents. But for me, as a sociologist of religion, vast majority of the people in the world who practice Christianity have no idea what those documents say, right? Does that make them any less of a Christian? Does that blunt their experience of God? I mean, I don't really think so. So some of the things that you've mentioned come out of those official documents, and the people within the institutions who have power and have a voice and have coverage of what what these documents say, and have authority to interpret them. But if you look and draw back to that everyday religion position that we've talked about earlier, most people have, it's not that important to them in terms of the way they live out their Christian lives or practice their spirituality or whatever. So trying to get away from the idea that religion is only what the people in power in the institution or the so-called official documents say. It is that, but it's not only that. So I think that distinction can be helpful for students. And also to bear in mind that even those official things change all the time, right? You get these ideas that religion is unchanging for centuries. It's just not. There are councils and general assemblies and people meet and they make a decision and things are changed, right? So when was 1972? Was that the year the Presbyterians decided to ordain women in Ireland? I think so, And so then all of a sudden, women can be ordained in this denomination, and that was a decision that was made after study of scripture and prayer and so on. And it was a change, So religion changes all the time. And I think that's really important for people to remember, because there's often this idea that it doesn't. And what was, not acceptable 50 years ago is now a norm. Say, for instance, the women's ordination in some of the Protestant denominations. And that brings me back to, you mentioned women in particular. Now, women in religion in Ireland is really quite interesting. I mean, it's interesting everywhere, but in the West, within Christianity, across all countries, basically, women are more religious than men in terms of the way that we measure religiosity. They tend to pray more. They tend to go to religious service more. They tend to identify as religious more than men. But in Ireland, that is not really the case anymore, particularly in the Republic of Ireland. It is the case in the North. Women show higher levels of religiosity than men. But in recent years in the South, that has pulled back a bit, and women have more equal levels of religiosity with men now, which is unusual. And I think there's something going on in Ireland with the way, women were treated, they weren't treated well in Christianity in a lot of contexts, but in Ireland, it maybe was particularly bad, with the Magdalene laundries and all the things that you have mentioned. I mean, there was a survey that was done by someone in Trinity College back in the early 2000s. And it was, 2010. This study found that 74% of Irish Catholic women thought that their church did not treat them with a lot of respect, but only 6% of Protestant women in the Republic felt that way. I mean, that is a huge difference in terms of how women felt they were being treated by their churches. And there's not been much research done in Ireland in terms of this emerging phenomenon of women, not being more religious than men as they were in the past. But I think it's a fascinating area that needs more research, to be fair. Yeah.
Gladys, you're encouraging me to ask more and more. Yeah. Can staying with that, the future. You've a crystal ball, and our relationship with religion in any shape or form in terms of how one stays within their spirituality. And I say spirituality not ignorantly. I say it as an encompassing term for all, because I would hope a lot more listen to this podcast and this important conversation, that it's not just Catholic or Protestant or evangelical, it's multiple. I for full share with people listening, I attend as many masses as I can, and in times want to. You'd find me in a church lighting a candle, taking a moment. I struggle sometimes to sit with long eulogies that doesn't have today's reference points into it, because my brain gets lost. I deep down, I'm in a rabbit hole right now that my therapist, Clodagh, had shared with me around Newman. Oh, his first name's gone for me.
John Henry Newman?
Henry Newman, who's a really fascinating person to listen to. As I shared, I will make a pilgrimage this summer to Lough Derg. Last year was my first year. I'm trying to look for merits here, but it's sounding like that, but I'm not really. It's more, I try and go find solace in places where spirituality has been held and is still held. But last year I was really taken back by heading to Lough Derg for my first time. And for everybody, just look it up, Lough Derg. It's a fabulous experience. I went out for the 3-day parade, as I like to call it, and it was amazing actually. Soulfully, I came back more refreshed than I could have on a sun holiday. Yeah. And for me, prayer is meditation in some cases. Yeah. I do remember walking around the church in Lough Derg, and some chap whispered to me, going, "You seem to walk around that a lot faster than I did." And I was like, we all have very different rosaries. Don't be comparing now. And as someone who is a pioneer, so I abstain from alcohol and other substances, I proudly wear my pin. And for those listening, Pioneer Association is associated with the Catholic Church. Their belief is through daily prayer, which I'm a little bit touch and go on, daily prayer and abstaining, support someone who can't abstain from alcohol and other substances throughout their life. So you do it as an act of service. And ultimately a phenomenal speech was made in my presence when I was 12. And that for me, when I made my confirmation, became, my mother would like to say it's because she's a pioneer and she inspired me, but it was multiple, particularly a woman called Eileen McCarthy. But I say all of that because you don't walk into any church now on a Saturday night or a Sunday or to Lough Derg and see too many people, particularly young people. Yeah. And I'd love to get your sense on that, because there's a few fold here. I think COVID-19 has played a big part, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I think the speed of which social media and life has, and the fact that our purpose is busyness now, and I generalize here, so apologies to anybody I might be insulting, who lives a much slower paced life by choice. I mean, I don't, and that's a choice that I'm trying to rectify. But I think the emphasis we place on material items and busyness and importance, and to your previous commentary on the church's power, we are scrambling in the dark looking for something that is bigger than ourselves to put ourselves into. So God or goddess, whatever it may be. And I know I rant there, but I wanted to share to you and listeners that I spiral in this every day to try and find a rooted world, and it's getting harder and harder. And then you step into a church and you're like, whoa, I might be the youngest here by a number of years. And that's not right either, because I've mates who are going through the same thing, but just doing it in a very different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that, it's related to wider societal trends that are common across the West. And, the rise of the big stuff, the rise of capitalism and materialism, it's not unique to Ireland. So we have to say that straight away. But then having said that, I mean, I think the churches in Ireland made some mistakes that, if these mistakes were rectified, could help address some of these problems. So I think one of the mistakes was, and again, repeating myself, to focus on power and conformity to a certain outward way of behaving and turning up at Mass, and kind of creating a laity who were quite passive. I think Irish Catholicism, last 20th century and before, created a passive laity, not one fully engaged. Now, and maybe that's not entirely fair to people, because I know in the past things like the novenas and sort of those sorts of things were meaningful for people. It did nourish spirituality, but by and large,
I mean, the rosary every day in people's houses was a way for families to come together. So, and I don't think that's happening in many houses, but it was the one moment where people came together.
Yeah, so Tom Inglis, who's a sociologist at UCD, was television killed the rosary.
Hey, it's true.
So, but by and large, there was the Irish Catholic Church, in its pursuit of power, created a passive laity. So that's a problem. And then it also neglected some of the traditions of the Catholic faiths that could fill some of those needs you're talking about. So, some of the, say, like the Jesuit practices of examen and meditative prayer and these sorts of things. I think, that was neglected within the Irish Church. Now, you can find it. You can go looking for it. But I don't think it's something that was put front and center and emphasized. And then the other thing that the churches have done, both North and South, is, I suppose, clinging to power through schools. There's this idea that the Catholic school in particular is going to create a Catholic. And it actually just doesn't. A lot. So, and again, it's helpful here to get some comparative research. So there's been a lot of research in the United States on young Catholics. And again, Kristen Smith, who I mentioned earlier, he's done a lot of this research. And Catholic school is actually, and in America, you have to choose to send your kid to a Catholic school, and it probably costs money. And a Catholic school does not really make much difference at all in whether that child turns out Catholic. What makes a difference is if the parents, both mother and father, go to church. That's important. But even that's not enough to really ensure that the thing to be adding to the parental going to church is talking about your faith at home. Okay. So that the actual intergenerational transmission of faith is not really going to happen unless it happens in the home. Those structures that the church created in terms of conformity and education, they may do a little bit, but they're not the key, the important thing. It's that in the home stuff. And, like you said, that practice of rosary, to the extent that could be a meaningful spiritual experience for people, that's what passes it on. And that actually reminds me of, I mentioned Father Jerry Reynolds earlier. I wrote his biography, and that was one of the things that was in his diaries about how, as a kid, praying the rosary and then the trimmings at the end, all the little things that his mother and uncles and such would pray for. That was an important spiritual practice for him. And like, I know I'm biased because I wrote his biography, but he's one of the great Irish Christians of the last century in terms of the role he played in the peace process and all that, So there was something there. I suppose there's something else. No, yeah. So, and young people, yeah. So the absence of young people, that is a big trend. Obviously, it's not as bad in the North as in the South in terms of church attendance and so forth. But it's declining in both places. And I think for this to be, meaningfully addressed, the focus has to come off the school, and it has to be on either the parish and the congregational level or the level of the family and the church community, because it just doesn't work to rely on and assume that schools are going to produce Christians. And again, to me, that's also the churches seeking that inappropriate use of power through the educational system. That doesn't produce authentic spirituality, or and maybe it does for some people, but it's not the most. Is why I don't think it's the right way, nor the most effective way for faith to be nourished in the next generation. And added to that, there needs to be less of a clericalism as well. And again, the Irish Church, especially the Catholic Church, but also the Protestant churches, have been criticized for being overly clerical models of church. And, the church is just not going to survive on this island if it's going to be too wedded to that model. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are other places in the world where, the priest isn't there every Sunday and the lay people do it all. And that may seem like a shocking thing. But if you think back to Stanley Hauerwas's comment, if the church is going to be dragged out of its passivity, this is the way God is killing it by dragging other people into positions of responsibility, maybe that's not such a bad.
It just, as you were sharing that, it reminded me of in 2016, I gifted myself the 30 days to head off on the Camino. I ended up coming off, and please, anybody listening to this, don't take this as a pinch of salt, because I ended up coming off with more questions than I had going. But I was taken back by a group of 5 men from a southern state, I believe Wisconsin. I lie further south, who a part of their church had 4 out of the 5 guys were thinking about joining the clergy and going on that journey. And as a community of churchgoers, paid for and sent these guys on. One was already studying in Italy and had joined the guys, and it was extraordinary to me. Here's young men, probably like 25-ish, 26-ish. The conversations around them were really extraordinary, and I'm really fortunate. We have a number of young parish priests that I've come across, my own in particular, and so it wasn't really foreign to me. Plus, I'm super interested and curious and probably nosy to ask like how they journeyed on this path. And because you don't hear about a lot of Irish young men joining or women joining the clerical order. But here are these 5 guys every morning, every evening, and various points throughout the day would read from scripture, talk about it. And as they walked, either were confirming where they were going or questioning and having an open discussion. It was extraordinary to witness. And you put that into today's context and the future of the churches, and religion as a whole, I should say, really. Like, where do you see us going as religious followers and as religious organizations?
Well, I mean, the old model's not coming back. Right? So, and I don't think it would be a good thing if it did come back, really.
I think some want to come back, though.
Well, that's a doomed project. Right. Even if it right or wrong, it's not, that's not going to happen. I'm fairly certain of that. So what you describe really, the small group and the minority, I think is really that the direction that things are headed in, and within that, I think it's, if I can use a word here, like witness, maybe. So not so much, that I talked earlier about, evangelization, trying to convert others to your way of thinking and almost trying to make them just like you. That's not really what the church should be about. And I don't think it will survive if it continues to try to be about that. But the idea of witness. So like what you just described there, you are witness to people living out their faiths. So there may have been things in that was attractive, things in that you found a bit odd or weird, but that's a witness. And the ability to do that in a public sphere, where you're not trying to convert anybody to your point of view, where you may encounter hostility, where you may encounter curiosity. I think that's really what Christians are going to need to do. And whether that witness can be compelling enough to, attract people to see, what's good in this sort of lifestyle and what's nourishing in that sort of lifestyle. That is where I suppose the rubber, will meet the road. And I suppose like the Catholic Church to a certain extent is trying to do that through the synodal pathway and so forth. But again, that is, it's institution led. Not everybody has participated in that, but it is an attempt to, I suppose, bring more people in and see where they're at, I guess. And to, I suppose we're very clear, it's not a consultation in the Catholic Church, is not a democracy, but, at least it is showing some interest in people's experience of faith and how they're actually living it out.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where priests will get married, have families, women will be more and more on the altar, LGBTI people will be able to get married in the church? Like, do you think we're so far away from that, or is that two form, and I don't mean to put you on the spot either, because I don't want to encompass all religions together, because they're not,
Yes.
nor all priests or clergy individuals together, because I have in-depth conversations with various priests and they're phenomenal. But can they change the entire structure of the system? Absolutely not. But equally, I work in politics, and I can say 4 years in that can't happen either. So, which is a bit difficult to always swallow. But like, do you think we'll get there, or at a case right now, it's the consultation phase, if that's the right way to phrase it?
Yeah, well, I don't think the current synodal process, whether the one in the Irish Church or the wider international Catholic Church, that's not going to produce it. But I think what Francis hopes that process will do is create a way of dialoguing within the church that makes more openness to these sorts of things. Do you know what I mean? It's about creating a way of communicating that allows more voices to be heard. So it's not going to get to those things straight away, but if it can embed a way of communicating within the Catholic Church that allows for the whole body of Christ to be heard and for the process to discernment to take place, you may get that. Now, the Catholic Church thinks in centuries, doesn't it? Which I've been told. But the thing I said before about religion changes all the time. It does change all the time. It might take centuries, but it does change all the time. I mean, and the Catholic Church, I'm definitely not going to put a timeline on this, but, we know that priests were married, 1,000 whatever years ago, before the celibacy thing was enforced. So we know that it happened before. I mean, I think within the Catholic Church, there'll always be a place for the celibate priest. I think maybe that place will be the religious orders. And, maybe, I don't know, 100 years down the road, you get back to the married priest. You might, I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to put a timeline on it, but I do know that religion changes all the time. And that the synodal process, if it works, could create a structure where there is more input from people other than archbishops and so forth. It may not work, and it may not actually accomplish that, but you can sort of see the seeds of that within the process itself, I think.
Is there anything I haven't asked you, Gladys, that you would like to put across? Because ultimately this conversation is about challenging biases, naming what needs to be named, and I would hope not put too much pressure on ourselves, but that people listen to this and go off and ask questions or look up things or sit and challenge perhaps what they've heard, and we don't tarnish everybody with the one brush. That's ultimately where I look, or as I jokingly said earlier on, when I do get challenged about how I could be LGBTQI, pro-choice, a politician, a pioneer, and also a practicing Catholic, they're like, I don't know what box to put you in. It's like, well, that's the problem. We're trying to find a space where you can put people, where in actual fact you just show up. And my rooted belief is to be rooted in faith and to be of service to the community, regardless of whatever form that takes in. But is there anything there that you feel people listening need to hear or need to understand from the work that you do and the fact that you've dedicated so much of your life to it?
Well, I suppose listening to you say that, it reminded me of someone I know who actually was raised evangelical Protestant, converted to Catholicism. And he was asked, why on earth are you in this church? For some of the reasons that you've just said in terms of, position on LGBTQ and married priest, all that sort of thing. And he's like, well, it's my church too. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's this idea that, the institution, if it's, well, I spoke earlier about sins. It's committed these sins and it's not reformed itself yet, and, has sought power when it should have. So maybe we should just leave it. But then there's something in his comment about, but hey, wait a minute, this is my church too. So that the idea of sticking in there and not leaving it to the people you disagree with, but being able to, disagree better and work through some of these things as well. And as doing that, going back to the aspects within the tradition of Christianity that had been neglected, probably in Ireland for centuries, some of those practices that that could nourish spirituality and so forth. I suppose sometimes in contemporary Ireland, you'd see stuff about mindfulness, meditation, et cetera, from quite a secular perspective. And I sort of think to myself, well, that's all there in the Catholic tradition, but nobody's looking for it there. But it is there. And it could be really helpful for people. I'm not saying don't look in the more secular versions of mindfulness or whatever, but some of the aspects of the tradition that have neglected being brought back in by the people who will say, well, this is my church too. I've had an experience of God here. And that's really important to me. So just, I suppose, maybe be open to that perspective as well.
Thank you. I'm super grateful. And I hope all the questions felt like, we were uncovering something or sharing something. I certainly learned a lot. So I'm super, super grateful.
Oh, thank you.
Gladys shared some incredible insights. When I was thinking about the Parachute Candidate podcast originally, the topic of religion was the first area I wanted to focus on. It is believed 85% of the world's people identify with the religion, with the most popular religion being Christianity, followed by 2.38 billion people worldwide, Islam, which is practiced by more than 1.9 billion people, moving on to Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism. Nearly 1.2 billion people worldwide remain non-religious or have atheist beliefs. And I believe our personal beliefs cannot be captured in the 280 characters of a tweet, or in one book, or even in one conversation like Gladys and I just had. And so this conversation is surely not done. Let me share two of Gladys's books for anybody interested in learning more of her work. First is Transforming Post-Catholic Ireland, and the second is The Deconstructed Church. I also highly recommend checking out her personal website, Building a Church Without Walls. I kept thinking after this conversation with Gladys of the poem Self-Portrait by David Whyte, and I carried in my wallet as its rooted reminder for me to be steadfast in humanity, and for me really seeks to understand God in everyday manner. And as I shared just now, the billions of people that follow religion and don't, this for me is such a close tie of what I think religion is, and maybe perhaps for you can identify it in some way. It doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned, if you know despair or can see it in others. I want to know if you are prepared to live in a world with its harsh need to change you, if you can look back with the firm eyes saying, this is where I stand. I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling toward the center of your longing. I want to know if you're willing to live day by day with the consequence of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I've been told, even in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God.